Alright, what's up everyone? Today we're just gonna be playing on my Summon Necromancer here. While I talk to you guys. While I talk to you guys about the different ways we can do microtransactions with the new Diablo game coming out. What could they do to possibly make money and still be good to the consumer? Alright, so essentially we have, this gaming culture where we can have games come out that aren't necessarily the best for the consumer because it's just a pitfall of microtransactions. And so it's like, how do you make a microtransaction that's actually faithful to what it's meant to set out to be, which is something that is non-game breaking, that can just positively influence the player and the player alone for a cost that can benefit the company in the form of currency. So you would just take your common example, which is like a skinned item, and you'd say, typically, that's not that bad of a microtransaction. You're just adding a different look to the item. What could that possibly harm? And it does actually have some problems with it. If you have an item in the game and you add different skins to it, right here we have a saber. I know it's a saber because I've seen these before, and that's what they look like, so this should identify as the angelic sickle. I don't think that can identify as anything else, and so you have this angelic sickle now. Now if I were to add a different look to this, if I were to change this blade to red, for example, and put this on, now people may look at that item differently. They may not recognize it as an angelic sickle. So it changes the way people interact with your game just by having skins. So how do you not sell? Okay, so that's just one problem with that, right? Okay, so now we have these other microtransactions that we could be using, which I think is the future of microtransactions for a game like this, where what you do is you have, in the case of Diablo 2, you would have an item to offer. You would be able to, let's say, purchase a rune, an Ort rune, from a Diablo 2 vendor for real life currency, and you could have this Ort rune in your game, and you could use it in a shield, for example, and it's in that shield, whatever, you're playing a game, you paid the money, it's just affecting you, no big deal, doesn't matter for anything, okay? And then the thing with this is that, let's say somebody joins your game, what would then happen is there would be a disadvantage between you and that player because you paid money, and then this game becomes pay to win. So in order to change that, what you do is you make it so that the item that they have appears in a chest or a vendor screen, and now this Ort rune appears in the screen that a joining player could then access and use for their gear to then PvP with you or then PvE with you. But it changes the dynamic to where they can't keep that item just so long as they're in the game. They have that item and they could put it in a shield like you did, or they could do something else with the rune. But as long as you didn't purchase that shield as well, you wouldn't necessarily have to offer that shield up. In the case of a rune with a shield, you probably would give both in the case of just an offered item to somebody to use. Just so you couldn't have tricksters just, you know, getting a bunch of runes and not offering up the bases as well. But essentially you can see here that if you had a microtransaction that offered up an item and then you then offer that item to everyone in the game, you would have people that were offering services where they would say, hey, join my game for a couple runes and I'll give you the chance to use, you know, Tyrael's Might for 2 hours, right? And that'll happen, but that's nowhere near as bad as having a black market where people just buy items and get items from people that aren't a corporation, because it's against game rules to pay for items. But if you make it so that in order to get items you have to pay a corporation, it's legal. And so that's how these microtransactions could exist, and then it eliminates that black market and everyone in the game is happy. You're not paid to winning anything, because at the end of the day, what you have is a chance to go and use these items that other people have and you have, and you can level up, and then maybe you get the edge that way because you bought the items and then you leveled up. But then if you really think about what end game content is, it's not necessarily about leveling up as much as it is about getting items in the game. And so if somebody bought these items, you know, they could play against a random number generator and get items that way just by having better items to begin with, to start with, because they paid for them. But that con is so minimal in the amount that it offers to the player, because it's an arrangement where you have both the company and the player saying, yes, I agree to this, that we should have these items exist just for these conditions. And so because of this agreement, because you have that, you basically create a space where you can have people that are using these items, and when they're using the items, they are leveling up their characters and stuff like that, and getting these items through the random number generator because they have the better items. But that's an encouragement for the player to play and to get these items. And so, yes, you are increasing a type of play where people don't necessarily earn their items to begin with right away, because they can just buy in right away and then earn the items that way and then use the items from there. But the main situation here is that if that happens, where you have items that are in the game before the player really earns them, and then they use those items to earn their items, it's going to create an atmosphere where you want to pay as much as you can to begin with, and then maybe not as much later on. And it's a con because this type of gameplay isn't necessarily what you would want. You would want the player to essentially start with nothing and like the grind of getting newer items and then eventually end game content items. So to eliminate that, what you do is you can make it so that when people use these in-game items, when they microtransactively buy them and they're constantly purchasing these items, a common solution is just to make these timed items. You know, that's one simple solution. Or if they are permanent items, then what the solution to that becomes is because this is downloadable content at that point, it's no longer a microtransaction because you get the item forever. It's basically like, that makes sense if you can just buy every game item and have that added to your character, because it's just like an instant unlock. Like, that makes sense for why you would have, you know, extra content added to the game and not necessarily microtransactions. So if they're going to keep it microtransactions, it's going to be more than one purchase of an item at a time, or you're going to want to keep coming back for the items. So this scheme only works if you have a lot of players, which it should, and so it's not really that hurtful in the grand scheme of things, because the solution being to add time limits doesn't actually solve the problem. It's more of a band-aid. And so ultimately this will still be a con. You're gonna have people buying into this early on and avoiding grinding and effectively injecting items into the game through that method of purchasing items that are better and best in slot, and then just grinding out other items that then they can sell, because maybe that these microtransaction items aren't tradable. For example, I would just make them not tradable. And then if you do that, and there are items that are tradable, and they're getting the tradable ones with the non-tradable items, because it's injecting items into the game, there's ways to further penalize that, but essentially it's just going to be more band-aids, when the real solution is to just not use this, because this is going to have this con, but this con isn't that big of a con overall. So you have microtransactions like skins that change the way that items look in the game, and that's problematic. And then you also have items in the game that you share with other players when you join their game, and that's problematic because people are going to use these items to get other items without necessarily having earned the right to use the item in the first place. But that isn't necessarily that big of a deal, that injection of items, because those players are purchasing an item that they're probably going to have for more than just a period of time. They're probably going to have it forever, and so it's more of like a downloadable content than it is a microtransaction. Even though it seems like a microtransaction because it's only a small amount of money for like one item, it's really downloadable content, and because of that, it's not really a con. It's just a way that the player decides to play the game, and though they're injecting items into the game, it's not that big of a con because it's like downloadable content to get those items to begin with. They're paying to have those instant unlocks, so it is kind of like they had to earn those items anyways, and you shouldn't penalize those players for just unlocking something and using an item. So there's that. Other types of microtransactions are things like level up bonuses and experience bonuses, and that's not really what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about this main form of microtransactions, the second one, where we have microtransactions that are in the game, but every time you purchase that item, it is shared with anybody else who's in that game. And that's because in this game, Diablo 2, items being shared with players makes it an equal playing field when you're in that game, and the only disadvantage outside of that game is the injection of items, which we talked about earlier. And the reason why you can't really penalize those players is because those players are playing with content which is more of like an instant unlock. And although it could be looked at as like, you know, a casual move, you have to welcome those players into your game to some extent and just accept that it is a decision for those players to have played like that. In early games, when you would have a piece of content released, it may take weeks before that item would be ended up on the marketplace. But if you have these microtransactions, you can just instantly inject the item into your game, and there's no real harm in that other than it's a change that we could come to accept and that is recommended to just accept, because if you have items that get put into the game before you really have this early game design choice of you have to go through the explored content without the content for a little bit before you get the content, like say an item. If you don't have that item and then you go and get the item, now it's the first item in the game, and then that item can sell for a lot of value. Well, if you just have these items that you can purchase, you know, they're not getting traded. These items aren't getting traded. They're just getting put into the marketplace in a way that the individual can use them and let other people use, but because they can't give it to everyone to use and they can't like trade the item, it keeps it limited to certain regions and certain locale, and it gives people certain reputations. So it's not necessarily the worst of things if somebody has an item. It's just a game design change of decision, you know. It's if you have people in a position where they have these items from buying them in the store before they have the items from grinding the content where the items would have dropped, that decision to do that is a gameplay decision where you allow people the choice to play with items before they get them, and then when they get them, that's the accomplishment, or maybe it was just getting the item to begin with was the accomplishment. And so it doesn't put pressure on people. It's just a gameplay choice. So you do miss out on that content being not in the game for a little bit. And, you know, there's a lot of hype provided by that, but think about the hype provided by the game being hosted by other players. Like, check out, I just bought this new item, you can play my game, and that sort of thing. That has its own hype behind it, and all I'm trying to say is that it's all about just a different variation of gameplay. And so if you think about it, they can do different releases. They don't always have to release the microtransaction with the initial release of the item, and they can wait a little bit and do stuff like that. I'm just saying, in an ideal world, what would it be? And what's the problem with this alternative for microtransactions that I'm proposing? Because if you have microtransactions that are shared to everybody in the game, and it's PvP, right? You take away the pay to win aspect of it, and you make it so it's essentially just who's the best player. And then when you do player versus environment, you're taking away the environment part because they're not having to grind out to get these items, and so you're just giving them the end game content. But it only becomes a problem for those players who actually put in the time to get those items with the items that they bought through the microtransactions. When they do that, when they buy those items and they grind out content and they get items, they still had to grind out the content. So when they put it on the market, it is kind of like those players earn those items. And so you could imagine there's going to be parties of players just trying to earn items using the new endgame content items, and it's just a different style of gameplay. So this is just an idea of what microtransactions could become, so that they're not as malicious and they're still equal to both parties and to what they provide. You know, it's not really hidden. It's not like a loot box. It's not like some random mechanic. It's, you get the item, it's shared to people, and it's going to change the way that you play the game because other people are going to have items that they didn't necessarily earn, and it allows them to play the game like that. So if they're gonna go to the black market and just play the game like that anyways, you might as well keep that as a revenue stream.